Thank you, Senator Rhiannon. Senator Singh.
I rise to make my contribution to the Senate about my time as a parliamentary advisor to the 71st General Assembly of the United Nations in New York during September to December last year. And at the outset, I would like to thank the Australian Senate for providing me with this opportunity to observe the work of the United Nations over such a significant period of time, and time obviously away from this place. The delegation, consisting of myself and Senator Bernardi, was located at the Australian Mission to the United Nations in the Wells Fargo building on 42nd Street in New York City, about a 15-minute walk from the UN building. And firstly, I would like to thank the Australian Ambassador to the United Nations, Ms Gillian Bird, and all of the staff in the New York Australian Mission for their professional advice and support during the 71st General Assembly. I particularly want to thank the Second Secretary, Julian Simpson, for his support and assistance throughout my visit. Australia, I think, can be very proud of the quality and dedication of our diplomatic staff and their hard work at this most important world institution. I'd also like to thank my Federal Labor Party caucus colleagues for choosing me for this unique opportunity to represent Australia at the United Nations. I also benefited greatly from meeting many individuals from non-government organisations, think tanks and universities who welcomed me during my time at the United Nations and gave me an opportunity to learn new approaches to a range of issues facing both our nations and indeed many nations across the globe. I also want to thank the staff at the Australian Embassy in Washington DC for facilitating meetings on key policy areas of interest and arranging meetings. I enjoyed meeting with congressmen and being at Capitol Hill at such a critical time in the US political cycle. I would like to give some observations of the United Nations as a global organisation and then discuss my observations and participation. Prior to leaving for this 3-month delegation experience at the UN, I had been a member of the Australian Parliament's Joint Parliamentary Standing Committee for Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade. I participated in a number of inquiries, including Australia's advocacy against the death penalty, the empowerment of women and girls in the Indo-Pacific region, as well as previously serving as a member of the Australian Parliament's Joint Standing Committee on Treaties. Before my time in Parliament, I had also served as President of the United Nations Association Tasmanian Branch. So to be able to put my understanding of the UN and its norms, structures, funds and programs into a real-life observation and participation was very exciting. During the first week in September, leaders of 193 countries merged in New York for the opening of the UN General Assembly, and I welcome the opportunity to participate in several official events arranged by the mission in association with the visit of the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister. I appreciated the opportunity to give a statement on behalf of Australia to the UN's Second Committee on Achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and importantly marking the Paris Agreement coming into force, underscoring our collective resolve to confront the challenges of climate change. I appreciated further General Assembly statements I gave in 3rd Committee and in 6th Committee on women's empowerment and on transboundary harm. And unlike the behaviour of perhaps the Australian Parliament at times, everyone listened politely, and the Australian Parliament, I believe, could learn something about how to behave from the UN General Assembly. There are clearly limits to what the UN, though, can accomplish. Trying to achieve consensus across 193 countries with their range of national interests is indeed a major hurdle. But the recent adoption of the 2030 Sustainable Agenda shows that it is still possible to achieve multilateral outcomes. Further, the structural fixture of the UN Security Council, with its 5 countries with veto powers set after World War II, makes consensus even more challenging. Progress can be stalled or blocked by any one of those 5, which I witnessed numerous times regarding the conflict in Syria. Yet throughout my 3 months' involvement at the UN, I became firmly of the view that for Australia to advance its own interests and regional interests, it was important that we were part of the decision-making process of setting international norms, standards and mechanisms, and then adhering to them. I certainly learned of the hard work, skilled negotiation and bridge building of diplomats. The effort to find common ground with one another rather than create conflict was impressive, and so too was the good-natured and professional approach of diplomats in trying to reach consensus. But of course the UN is not perfect, marked by its inability to deal with a myriad of issues in the Middle East, particularly Syria. Also, it's a 70-year or more old organisation and in some areas is very, very siloed. That is where it is important that the new Secretary-General to the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, takes a lead to take on much-needed reforms. It was an exciting time to be at the UN with the appointment of a new Secretary-General, something that usually only happens around every 10 years. And I had the opportunity to witness the informal talks and meetings where candidates for the Secretary-General position spoke to the Member States on their vision and their candidature. And I was also very impressed to look at the transparency and the openness of the selection process and the number of candidates, including a number of female candidates. Then on the 13th of October in 2016, Antonio Guterres was appointed with the endorsement, of course, of the UN Security Council. He was appointed by the UN General Assembly to be the 9th UN Secretary-General. Mr Guterres' time as the Commissioner for the UNHCR included the largest movement of people seeking asylum since the end of World War II. This makes him a very qualified individual to deal with the challenges ahead in the movement of people and issues for people seeking refuge. Also, when he was Prime Minister of Portugal, Mr Guterres helped lead the campaign for the international intervention to stop the violence in East Timor following the vote of Timorese independence. I also had the privilege to meet the outgoing UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon, whose tenure ended in December. He leaves, of course, a legacy at the UN as the Secretary-General that brought in the 2030 Sustainable Agenda, led key human rights initiatives and directed the historic Paris Agreement on climate change and ratified it in record time. But for one of the biggest highlights for me was the UN Refugee Summit on the 19th of September. It was a high-level plenary meeting addressing the large movements of refugees and migrants with an aim to bringing countries together behind a more humane and coordinated approach. Importantly, it was the first time that the UN General Assembly had called for a summit at the heads of government level on the large movements of refugees and migrants since the Refugee Convention was adopted in 1951. It was indeed a watershed moment in history. Member States, including Australia, reached agreement by consensus on a powerful outcome document known as the New York Declaration, outlining the political will of world leaders to save lives, protect rights and share responsibility on a global scale. Importantly, it commits Member States to negotiate a comprehensive refugee response framework and, separately, a global compact for safe, orderly and regular migration for adoption in 2018. The world faces a difficult political and social environment on migration. Current systems are failing, and with only 8 nations currently taking in 86% of the world's refugees, more must be done to encourage and support other nations to accept displaced people. The commitments made are bold, but I look forward to them hopefully shaping a more compassionate and effective migration policy across the globe, and indeed for Australia to play its part. I participated in a number of high-level side events that provided insight into different strategy countries are adopting towards refugees and migrants. I learnt about Canada's remarkable national project to settle 25,000 Syrian refugees in just 4 months. They made the refugee situation a whole-of-society approach, not just the responsibility of government. Trade unions, churches, NGOs, universities, businesses all expressed wanting to do something. And a strong theme was also the importance to give dignity and the full potential to live a better life through ensuring refugees can become more self-reliant and be able to take their lives into their own hands. To achieve this, there needs to be better partnerships between government, humanitarian actors and private enterprise. The UNHCR highlighted that refugees are people with remarkable skills, and if we provide the enabling environment, positive change can happen. If refugees are allowed to work and move, they can be contributing people in host countries and become a key contributor in their economies. But most importantly, the UN Secretary-General ended the session highlighting that there should be no politics when it comes to human life. I couldn't agree more. The UN Security Council, which met on numerous occasions at various times of the day and night throughout my 3 months at the UN, whilst their main aim of the Council was to pass resolutions for a ceasefire in Aleppo, Russia continually used its veto power to block such an outcome and have been accused of barbarism and committing war crimes. This is one of the worst conflicts seen this decade. It is a complete affront to humanity. The attacks on this civilian population of Aleppo are an appalling humanitarian disaster and a complete breach of international law. France drafted a UN Security Council resolution to impose a ceasefire on Aleppo, which would have meant a new US and Russia truce and the grounding of Syrian airstrikes and military fighting in Aleppo. That would then have allowed the aid convoys to have hopefully made it back into Aleppo. However, on Saturday night, October the 8th last year, Russia used its veto power to vote down that resolution. It was the 5th time Russia had used its veto against a UN resolution on Syria during the more than 5-year conflict. I also attended a number of important briefings in the UN Security Council about the concerning situation in South Sudan. The horrific nature of this tribal war has resulted in a mass displacement of now 1 million refugees fleeing the country and 4.8 million people facing severe food insecurity. The panel report outlined the relentless obstruction and attacks against UN and humanitarian missions and the grave outcome of the killing of 67 aid workers since the outbreak conflict in December 2013. The most confronting was the report of conflict-related sexual violence and the ongoing killings of civilians, women, children and the elderly. The permanent ceasefire hasn't been respected by the parties since July, and there was mention of the need for the Security Council to impose an arms embargo in order to prevent further destabilisation of the security situation and the large human rights violations. My time at the UN covered a diverse range of issues, more than I can perhaps go through this evening. But they did include human rights, gender equality and women's reproductive rights, the rights of children, nuclear disarmament, Indigenous and refugee issues. I was pleased to sit in on the statement delivered in Third Committee by Australia's very impressive youth representative to the UN, Chris Eagland, who gave an impressive and strong message about the importance of inclusion of all people and the need to mobilise young people around the world in order to achieve the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. I met with Australia's Ambassador for Women and Girls, Natasha Stott-Despoja, to discuss the challenges of gender equality, particularly in the Asia-Pacific. I also met with Princess Mary of Denmark about women's health initiatives following her contribution made at the UN on women and girls' access to reproductive health, as part of the Safe Birth Even Here campaign. I also met with a number of women from neighbouring Pacific Island nations, including Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Samoa and New Zealand, to discuss some of the challenges we and our neighbours face together. The permanent mission of Brazil and Guatemala, along with ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, invited me to speak at a UN side event on the negotiations for a legally binding instrument to ban nuclear weapons, as put forward by the open-ended working group. This was a critical issue facing the UN in October, resulting in the UN General Assembly adopting a landmark resolution to convene a conference in 2017. Australia, unfortunately and surprisingly, voted against the resolution, even though the resolution is regarded as an end of 2 decades of paralysis in multilateral nuclear disarmament efforts. I also participated in the high-level meeting to ever take place in the UN to protect LGBTI people. The LGBT core group is a cross-regional group including 19 countries, as well as the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the European Union and Human Rights Watch, and included the US's Vice President Joe Biden, Prime Minister of Norway Ms Erna Solberg, and the UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon. There are still 70 countries where it is a crime for LGBTI people to live openly. They are being killed just for being who they are. Vice President Biden spoke passionately on the human rights of LGBTI people across the globe and reflected on the recent Orlando nightclub shooting, which was the first time the UN Security Council, in condemning the violence, used language recognising violence targeting the LGBTI community. I also had a range of meetings at the UN Secretariat building, including briefings from UN Office of Disarmament and the UN Department of Safety and Security's Under-Secretary-General Peter Drennan, a former Australian official. I also met with key officials in UNICEF to discuss children's rights and the incredible work and operations of UNICEF. Equally, I met with key officials of UNFPA, the UN Population Fund, on their work to deliver strong health systems for women and girls' access to reproductive health, safe childbirth and family planning. Whilst I was at the mission, Australia's campaign and bid for a seat on the UN Human Rights Council was underway, the first time we have sought a seat on the Human Rights Council. My view is that, whilst I'm not against our bid, I do see it as an opportunity for Australia to improve our record on human rights for Australia's First Peoples and for the treatment of asylum seekers and refugees. There is a lot more work to do this year for Australia to be confident of our election to the Council, but I do wish the Australian mission all the best in their bid for that seat. Of course, I was also in New York at a pivotal time in the US election cycle. A lot of people I met with were concerned that the work, deliberations and resolutions passed at the UN would be under threat with a change of administration. I'm really not sure what direction a Trump administration will take towards the United Nations, but I do hope that President Trump recognises the importance of the United Nations in terms of an international rules-based order. Despite the challenges the UN faces, the fact that all the nations of the world are sitting down and talking to each other rather than killing each other to try to resolve the world's most pressing issues is indeed a critical step for humanity. It was indeed a privilege to work at the United Nations. I look forward to utilising this special opportunity to promote understanding of the benefits of an international rules-based institution, which I believe is so fundamental to achieving peace and security and human rights and equality for all people. Thank you.